Delighted now to be joined by Christine Jardine, Scottish Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West and their Treasury spokesman, but also someone who in the old days of the coalition worked in Downing Street and knows a little of how these things function. Christine, good to see you. Do you think the press has been even-handed in this?
I think that there is only one person to blame for this, Alistair. I think we can, dance round the issue and say, oh, but this leak has come from here. The only person responsible for this mess is Boris Johnson, because as the leader, he sets the tone. And the tone that he has set has created a culture, which we are now learning, was ignoring the rules, was having drunken parties, when at a time when they should have been, paying attention to, for want of a better expression, affairs of state. They were showing disrespect to the country. And the significant thing, one of the most significant things for me about the disrespect, if you like, they showed the Queen and the apology that's now had to be made, is that the Queen is the head of the state and representative of the country. And it just represents the complete contempt that this government was showing for what the rest of us were going through in 2020 and 21.
To what extent do you think it's also revenge by the media for Brexit? Because Lord Adonis says if Boris goes, Brexit goes.
I don't think Brexit has got anything. Now, I'm a Liberal Democrat, and I think Brexit has got nothing to do with this. This is about the behaviour of the Prime Minister and the behaviour that he encouraged at the heart of government. Now, Brexit aside, it's got nothing to do with it. When we were campaigning in North Shropshire in the by-election just before Christmas, nobody mentioned Brexit. The voters of North Shropshire were not thinking about Brexit. They were thinking about the mess that the government is in, and the government that they saw as being out of touch with the problems that they were facing every day as a result of the pandemic, the growing cost of living crisis, inflation, the economic crisis that we could be facing shortly. All of that is what people cared about. And central to it was the fact that they felt that they were being taken for granted by the government, that the government wasn't aware of the reality of the situation. And then we have more party stories, and we realise that, not only were they not aware of it, to some extent it feels as if they just didn't care. And that's what's at the heart of this.
Absolutely fascinating point, because you said a moment ago, and I clocked it and registered it, about the Prime Minister setting the tone in Downing Street. And a lot of people have said, this would never have happened under Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, definitely not, and what have you. And I mentioned in the intro that you used to work in there. How much is this an example of foolish, bright youngsters tarnishing the image of Downing Street and the PM having to take the hit for it?
It doesn't work that way. He's the Prime Minister. He set the tone. The buck stops with him. And to throw, young, hard-working advisors, civil servants, to throw them under the bus would be unforgivable, because yes, they were the ones that were at the parties, but is the Prime Minister honestly telling us that he was not aware of what went on in Downing Street? Because if he wasn't, then in a way that's just as bad, because if he didn't know about the parties, then he should have done, because it's in his office. He lived upstairs. He is the Prime Minister. He should know what is going on in Downing Street. Now, I didn't work for David Cameron. I worked for Nick Clegg.
Yeah, sure.
But I have to say, David Cameron knew what was going on in Number 10. Nick Clegg knew what was going on in his team. I'm absolutely sure that Gordon Brown and Theresa May knew what was going on. If Boris Johnson didn't, then that is another problem. Why does he not know what's going on in Downing Street? And he cannot pass the buck to other people for his ineptitude.
Final question doesn't come from me, but we invited people who cared passionately about this. And this one comes from Jan, and she says, why have the elderly and children been the prime victims of the pandemic policy response, imprisoned in care homes and hospitals, and kids forced out of education, and even now children wearing masks? Don't they understand the visceral anger that their policies have caused?
I don't think they do. I think they might have some idea of it now. Certainly, I think some Conservatives in the government do. because you could feel it in Parliament this week when we spoke in the debate, which the Paymaster General answered rather than the Prime Minister.
Yes.
When we spoke in that debate, we were all saying, "Do you not understand?" And we could see from the few Conservatives who were there that some of them did, and it was clear in PMQs, in the atmosphere, the anger which was coming from the opposition benches, because we all feel it very strongly. We all know people who, I'm lucky. I have had, I think, an incredibly fortunate pandemic. I have not been seriously ill. My close family have not been seriously ill. I lost one uncle who unfortunately took ill during the pandemic. But I know people, I have friends who had to watch loved ones die, on FaceTime because they couldn't be there in the hospital, who couldn't have their goodbyes with elderly relatives. And you could feel that in the comments, that anger, that, directed at the government, directed at Boris Johnson. And what was interesting was that when he stood at the dispatch box, what we were getting back from the other side of the chamber was not defence of that. It was, from a lot of people, an acknowledgement that, he'd got it wrong. And they weren't willing to stand up in PMQs and defend the Prime Minister.